RIC. Tonight we've got Maggie Chapman and Neil Davidson introducing a discussion on Brexit, something which probably we have organised previous discussions, but I think if we probably say the left overall, it's something we haven't really been on the front foot with. We've been probably too responsive. But anyway, Maggie and Neil will speak for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion after that. And we want to make it a discussion rather than just playing table tennis back and forward to the speakers, although they will come back at the end as well. Okay, so actually I didn't ask you to go first.
I'm going to go first. And is it easier if I stay seated?
Yep.
Yes, it's okay.
That's fine.
But Pete's blocking Neil.
Technology is wonderful, isn't it? Sight lines are all important. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion this evening. I look forward to hearing actually from you as well. Neil and I have discussed Brexit a few times together, and I think you'll hear quite a lot of agreement between us. I think one or two differences, and we'll touch on those later. But I think, given the political turmoil and instability that is the Brexit shambles, it's really important, as Pete said, that we on the left come together and work out actually what we do, because it's not enough for us to keep just reacting to things. In 121 days, the UK will leave the EU, or is due to leave the EU, I should say. 121 days followed by a period of transition of some length. No, we don't really know how long that transition will be, if it happens. Probably the only thing we know for sure is that Theresa May's deal at the moment doesn't have widespread support. Freedom of movement won't cease on the 20th of March next year, and that will upset all of those for whom immigration was such a major factor in their decision to vote leave. Many, not all. May's proposing a backstop to the backstop, possibly even to a backstop on the Northern Irish border issue, and yeah, who knows what that means. There's nothing certain for fisheries, which is crucial to Scotland's economy, especially the economies of the North East. We know that food and medicine supplies won't change much, we think, until the end of the transition period, but we don't actually know. In short, it's a shambles, it's a mess. So where does that leave us? I think Neil will cover some of the problems of the EU, some of its history, but I think it's important when we think about the EU that we don't conflate all EU institutions into one. The euro, for instance, presents a very different set of problems to the European Union as an institution itself. I think if we look at what happened in Greece, the austerity imposed on Greece was the result of a wrong-headed economic, fiscal, currency project. But it is no more the case that that was intrinsic to the EU than cuts and pay restraint is intrinsic to the British or Scottish governments. The EU is a complex beast. And where we disagree, because there are elements we disagree, I think probably some of our biggest disagreements may be on tactics and how we get to where we might want to be. But we can talk a little bit more about that later. But I think one thing is really, really crucial. We need to get beyond the fatuous arguments about how one side is wrong because it's got Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson on it, or how the other side is right because it's got, or the other side is also wrong because it's got Tony Blair and Nick Clegg on it. It's childish and petulant, and it doesn't do our politics any justice. And I think, so rather than necessarily debate the merits or otherwise of EU membership per se, I think the challenge for us, as I said at the beginning on the left, is what should we be doing? What can we unite around, and where does that leave us? I think we've spent quite a lot of time talking about Brexit itself and the shambles, and it's very tempting to do that because, it's fun to point out shambles of other people's making. But we haven't spoken much about what causes led to Brexit and what we should be doing about those. And that's important because as withdrawal date draws closer, so the expected benefits, or lack thereof, will come into focus. And whatever happens after March next year, I think risks deeper divisions amongst progressives and deeper divisions on the left can enable a much stronger and quicker rise of the hard right. So I think we need to talk about austerity and we need to talk about immigration and what our response to those two things on the left should be. The reason why the hard right wanted a Brexit referendum was precisely that it could unleash a racist force and divide the left, divide communities. And we can't afford to fall for that tactic. Because Brexit can never solve the problems it was meant to address, those two main drivers, as I've said, austerity and immigration, or opposition to immigration, and the presence of black, Asian, and minority ethnic people in the UK. Brexit was never going to do anything about either of those things. It's not going to end austerity. It's not going to make Britain white again. And in many ways, no Brexit can be sufficiently Brexity for the Brexit enthusiasts. And that makes any outcome over the coming 121 days plus transition into the future, makes it fertile territory for division and for the hard right. And in many ways, I think that's why they were so keen on it in the first place. So any failure to leave the EU, I think, will be met with a massive recruiting drive on behalf of the hard right, and I think it will be successful. They will be able to make that the case. They will be able to make the case that democracy doesn't work. People voted for this thing and it hasn't happened, so we should have authoritarianism instead. And I think that that's very likely if Brexit is somehow stopped. But it's also, I think, what will happen if we have a Brexit that doesn't end austerity or cease immigration, doesn't create the racially pure Britain. In other words, any actual possible Brexit. I think wherever we are, we see the potential for the right to gain the ascendancy. I think those of us who think about and talk about and understand politics and economics know that ending austerity is going to be much more difficult outside the EU than inside the EU, at least in the short term. There will be some kind of economic shock after Brexit, which will reduce tax revenues, increase unemployment. And we know that it's impossible and wrong-headed, morally, on every possible level, to think that we need to end the racial mix or stop the racial mix increasing. None of us wants to go back to the lack of racial mix of the 1950s. So we need to focus on the causes of Brexit and the real solutions to those, how we make the case on austerity, how we need to win the argument for immigration and against racism. And I think if we look at these two causes of Brexit, there have been effective campaigns against austerity. But the lesson from the Brexit vote is that they need to be clearer about how austerity can be ended, not just that it is a bad thing. We focus on the problems of austerity rather than the ways in which we could end it. There's good evidence that people believe that there's a limited amount of money which has to be allocated by government, and this, we know, is not true, but it makes for a very simplistic argument and a very sellable argument. And it makes arguments against the EU and other international adventures or ventures, including things like international aid, very attractive. Stop that so we can spend that limited amount of money on ourselves. And I think that is a significant part of what made people fall for the notorious £350 million a week for the NHS lie. So we need to change how we do politics in order to understand how we end austerity, so we can avoid Brexit becoming a permanent recruiting agent for the far right. If we look at immigration, though, there hasn't been an effective campaign in favour of immigration, I think, and that's what we need to change. The first priority must be to make the moral and economic case for immigration. Immigrants have the right to be here. It's not just Scotland that is a mongrel nation, after all. Immigrants make our economy and our public services function. They make our communities richer. They make our culture and our identities richer. So we have to be on the front foot about immigration and race. And in some ways, whether you are in favour of Brexit or not, whether you are campaigning for a people's vote or not, addressing these two issues must be a much higher priority. We are at a very dangerous juncture in our politics, and we need to ensure that we speak as a voice on the left to the concerns that led to the Brexit vote. I think we're faced with a simple choice of Brexit outcomes, May's deal notwithstanding. I see three different ways that it could still go. First, through a variety of different machinations, Brexit in name only, or by no. It looks a little bit like an EEA sort of relationship that brings with it contributions to the European budgets, requirements to abide by Commission regulations and decisions, access to the single market, freedom of movement of people. However, it also means no say in how EU policy is developed and implemented. And it brings with it, as I say, a very real and, I think, very terrifying risk of a right-wing rebellion at Brexit denied. None of us wants to see the further rise of fascism on our streets. We don't want to see that gain any further purchase in our politics. It's too late to avoid it completely, but we have to do what we can to avert a deeply racist anti-immigrant backlash. The second Brexit that is possible is, I think, even given what May's deal says, or maybe because May's deal fails, is what we might call the Tory Brexiteer Brexit, global Britain, signing trade deals, left, right and centre, reorientation away from the EU and towards other markets. But this brings with it a period of very deep economic reorganisation. Once we've moved to WTO rules, and before we've negotiated any other trade deals or relationships. The economy in this context will be low wage, low regulation, no worker protection, increasing inequality, the removal of social protections, privatisation and charging of things like the NHS, like the US model, privatised education, road user charging, marketisation of local government services, rubbish collections, and so on and so on. It is the Jacob Rees-Mogg model. And I think many of us campaigned against TTIP. We disliked is maybe too weak a word, but we campaigned vehemently against TTIP. I think this kind of Brexit brings a TTIP with every trade deal, only with much less sovereignty, because our negotiating weight will be much reduced. The incentive, for instance, under TTIP for the United States was to make concessions because of access to a 500 million people trading environment, access to that market. It just doesn't seem plausible to me that the US are going to make any concessions, any more concessions for a market of 70 million people. Especially at a time when the US president and the US economy is reorienting away from those kinds of international trade markers. It seems that just as Britain joined the EU late, so it seems that this is us joining the global trading economy just as it comes to an end, or as how we've known it for the last four decades comes to an end. We on the left need to understand that this model of Brexit, having to negotiate new trade deals everywhere, brings with it everything that is bad about the EU. It is a sprint to the bottom, with immiseration as the stick and low-quality imports as the carrot. And the third possibility, I think that's still possible, is that we could have what we might call the Jeremy Corbyn model, or Cuba model. Britain insulated from the global economy, much less access to global goods, the replacement of some of those with domestic industries, but the move away from having as many consumer goods, as much choice, because they'll all be so much more expensive. This is a much poorer country, but probably much more equal and much more solidaristic. It also requires a massive reorientation of what people's life expectations are. And it's not really clear to me that it's deliverable, desirable, possible, or what anybody has been or has been campaigning for or wanted. Nobody in all the anti-EU campaigns that I've seen has made a coherent case for this, for lower life expectations in Britain, even if that means a more equal, more solidaristic country. No one has said to people that our material standard of living will reduce substantially, even if the upside is having more time to spend with family, working a 4-day week, those kinds of things, which many of us are in favour of. And I think it's really telling that we've never heard anyone try to make the case for this, even from a party for whom this has been their goal, the CPB. It's been their programme since the 1970s. They're not advocating this either. And they and others are saying, oh, Brexit won't have the kind of negative impact on people's life expectations. Nothing much will change. So I think those are our three potential options still, and so we need to galvanise around them. And I think one of the things in everything that's happened to date is just how disappointed I've been in Jeremy Corbyn and in Labour. We all know that he doesn't agree with EU membership. We all know he was elected to be true to his principles. So why hasn't he put a left-wing case for Brexit, strongly, forcefully galvanising support and power around it? Why isn't he making the case for an immigration system based on human rights rather than geography? Why isn't he making the case for using procurement rules and ownership to transform our economies? I think he thinks there just isn't public support for these positions. And therefore, that means, I think for us, that is our job, to make sure that we create the public support for those. We must build support for a human rights-led immigration policy. This needs to be not only in Scotland, not only in the UK, but at a Europe-wide level. But we desperately need it in the UK, especially following any kind of Brexit. We need to develop an understanding of how a poorer country can be more solidaristic, what that looks like, so we don't end up blaming immigrants and minorities and people who rely on social security for any post-Brexit economic downturn. I do worry that some on the left are transfixed by the problems of the EU, perhaps especially the euro, that there isn't really the space or the time to discuss the real problems that will come with Brexit because of what's happened in the last couple of years around the nature of what is possible. I've heard people claiming that the British ruling class will grant us progressive policies after Brexit. Don't wait for a second. The hard right have a betrayal narrative ready to go. Blaming benefits rounders, blaming immigrants, blaming social democrats, blaming the Irish, blaming any other number of their favourite targets. So what we have to do is win the material arguments here. In 2008, the capitalist class crashed the world economy, and they blamed it successfully on benefits claimants and immigrants. Don't think that because the British ruling class is in a mess that they won't be able to blame the outcome on others again. So I think our task is a challenge. It's to put aside the differences that have for so long and on so many different levels divided us on the left and say, these are the two big challenges of our time. Immigration, how we fight for immigration and how we fight to end austerity. And I think that's what we need to unite around, regardless of whether we are pro or anti the EU. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Maggie. So we'll hand over to Neil now, and then after that we'll have discussion.
Okay, I'll try not to repeat anything that Maggie said, much of which I agree with. And I'll talk a bit about the nature of the crisis of a ruling class and what that means for us, the opportunities that possibly poses for us. Before I do that, I just want to make one comment about social change, not even revolution, but any kind of major change of any sort. It doesn't happen without major disruption, chaos, disorder, and so on. People think that Scottish independence is going to be a smooth little operation where we all just vote and then, we're independent and so on. Forget it. It's going to be chaotic and apparently disastrous, will involve lots of possibly problems economically and so on. The Scottish economy is far more integrated into the British economy than the British economy is integrated into the EU economy. So it's going to be worse, right? So we need to face that. So the idea that there's chaos and there's problems isn't in itself necessarily something that we should throw up our hands in horror and go, oh my God, it's going to happen in any circumstance if we have any kind of progressive change at all. We'll start from that kind of situation. Now, of course, there's a problem also for our rulers, who have I think at least 4 levels of difficulty. facing them, which is good for us, or potentially good for us if we can take advantage of their problems. I think sometimes on the left there's a tendency to assume that the ruling class always has a cunning plan up their sleeve, but if it is, it's like Baldrick, right? A disastrous misconception which will lead to catastrophe. Is generally what's going to happen here. We over-rationalise the ruling class's ability to see its own interests and to act in its own interests. And I said, this is what they would do if they were acting like a proper ruling class. That isn't necessarily what they behave like. And I can quite clearly see they haven't behaved in a rational way over this for these reasons. So first of all, there seems to be a major problem of personnel. Like, these people just aren't up to it. The decline in the quality of the British ruling class has been truly shocking over the last 30 or 40 years. And the reason for that, which has actually come out of neoliberalism, is because they haven't had any contestants, they haven't had to fight to establish their position in the way that Churchill or Lloyd George or Thatcher had to do. And also because there's been a general level of agreement about neoliberal economic policy in both the Tories and New Labour. There's been disagreements about social policy to a certain extent, but economically people have agreed. So there hasn't been a kind of contestation about future directions or anything like that. So consequently, these people have never been challenged, and they're basically not up to the job. They're divided into, I think, 4 or 5 possible groups. First of all, there's total opportunists like Boris Johnson, who didn't actually want Brexit, now does. Now, he doesn't have any principles at all, right? He's simply trying to manoeuvre for his own personal interests. Then there's a bunch of hard ideologues for a certain kind of hard Thatcherist position, which Rees-Mogg would certainly be one of those. But whether that's what the actual ruling class, that's the actual ruling class in Britain, the CBI, the kind of owners and so on want, I think is debatable. They certainly don't want to leave the EU, which I think is something we really need to take quite seriously. But there are people who have these kind of ideological positions. There are people who've used anti-migration positions as a tactical position to keep the Tory party in office, because they see that as being a hostility to migrants in the country and want to build on that, without realising what that would actually do in terms of the vote for Brexit, because I don't think they expected, they certainly didn't want to leave the EU, but they thought that they would be able to use this simply as a means of putting people on the line and so on. That's backfired badly on them. They don't, by the way, the British ruling class doesn't want to stop migration coming into this country. They want to control it. They want migrants to be insecure and to feel looking over their shoulders and to be pliable and so on. They don't want to stop it. That's why they were cheering May at the CBI last week, because she's actually come up with a proposal for getting people to migrate to Britain for these short-term 5-year limits and so on, which then be used as a labour force for capital. They certainly don't want to stop it any more than the American ruling class want to build a wall between Mexico and Texas. They don't. This is nuts. They're completely opposed to this. So we have to be aware of this. There's a rhetoric about migration, and there's reality of what capital actually wants from its government. Then there are 2 groups of what we're calling the actual ruling class, actually economically the ruling class. That is quite small capitalists, verging into the petty bourgeoisie, the kind of people who suffer the most from EU regulations and rules, the ones who find it most difficult to meet them because they haven't got that money and are on the borderline of survival and so on. And then at the opposite extreme, quite big capitalists who don't really deal with Europe but deal with other parts of the world and therefore don't care whether they're or not. Someone like Souter, in a Scottish context, who owns about half the Indian transport infrastructure, for example, he doesn't care. That's why he also supports independence, because his interests are either in Scotland or actually in Asia. So there's a kind of problem of the personnel of the ruling class, certainly at the political level. Consequently, there's a problem of strategy, which is the second crisis. Now, people have often invoked here, Suez or Munich as potential comparisons for Brexit. I think this is underestimating it significantly. Munich was a tactical shift to keep Hitler off or be prepared and so on. Suez was a miscalculation because the British thought the Americans would back us, and of course they didn't because they wanted to take over from us. But this, I think we're talking more about Operation Barbarossa-style catastrophes here. That's the German invasion of Russia in 1941. This is the level of miscalculation that's happened. And it's not the only one. Indie Ref, that was supposed to be a walkover, right? And instead they almost lost. We almost won. Brexit itself, they didn't expect Brexit to happen, lost that as well. And then there was the election of 2017, which they expected to get a gigantic majority and lost the majority and left independent on DUP. Every single one of these has been an unbelievable blunder by the Tory party, the party of British capitalism for the last 320 years, right? With some variations, but by and large, it's been the party that represented them. Which brings me on to the third problem, the problem of party. There have been points in British history where parties have split apart because there have been intolerable contradictions within them over the Corn Laws for the Tories in 1846, for the Liberals over Irish Home Rule in the 1880s, and for Labour over kind of the Bennett left in 1981. All these resulted in splits. That would appear to be what's happening here, except I don't think it will happen, I think the Tories are locked together in a kind of death embrace from which they cannot separate themselves out because the dangers are too serious of setting up a new party is simply an impossibility, I think, in these conditions. So they're stuck, which leaves the ruling class with a problem. Who is going to be the party that's actually going to act for them, given the bloody awful bollocks that the Tories are making of this? Labour aren't to be trusted in the same kind of way, although people read the Financial Times and the sensible papers of the ruling class, like not the Express or the Mail, but the Financial Times and so on, you'll get where they actually talk to each other. Looking, Corbyn, maybe that wouldn't be so bad, at least he's not an idiot. You know, maybe, you know, McDonnell, he's quite sensible. You know, I mean, seriously, there have been articles, people saying this, we can control them, is the basic idea. And they'll actually have a rational position for capital, they'll invest in infrastructure and so on. So, I mean, this has been going on for a bit. Now, May was treated with adulation at the CBI, I think partly because I think she's come up with some kind of plan, you know, and not the complete catastrophe of a no plan Brexit or a no deal Brexit. But that doesn't mean they think that she's actually going to deliver. And they certainly aren't looking to Boris and Rees-Mogg to lead them as a kind of political representation. I mean, you know, so they have a difficulty here. And it's not one that's easily resolvable, because Labour, not because of the Labour politicians and the Labour right, would love to cosy up to the CBI and so on, but the mass membership of the Labour Party now is quite different in its attitude and would not allow that, I think, to happen quite that way. That doesn't mean there aren't problems with the Labour Party. There are, but nevertheless, it's not entirely, it's not something that can just be incorporated. And finally, the fourth problem is the problem of the state itself and the danger that Brexit is posing. A, for the reunification of Ireland, for the first time in my lifetime, really, you know, it's a serious possibility. And secondly, of Scotland's independence, which ironically would mean that the Britain that they want to actually take out of Europe would no longer exist, would collapse, and you'd build with England and Wales, which is not quite the same thing, is it? So this is a real difficulty for them, and we shouldn't underestimate it, the problems they have, because I think there's a tendency for us to go, oh my God, Brexit is going to be so terrible, without realising it's also a huge problem for them, which we can take advantage of. So the left's, I think, problem, and Maggie's outlined some of this, is obviously the problem of the far right, or the hard right, and the kind of difficulties they're posing. Now, two things to say here. First of all, Brexit didn't create the racism and the anti-migrant feeling, right? It was there before. It revealed it. It exposed it, and it was still there. Consequently, going back into the EU or leaving them going isn't going to solve that. People aren't going to stop being racist or having anti-migrant views because we go back into the EU. Actually, what that's more likely to do, and the point's already been made, is to simply encourage a betrayal narrative about democracy being sold out. The point has to be tackled. People have to be challenged, argued with, and solutions to their problems presented of why they ought to take this on in the first place. There's plenty of evidence that the hardest anti-migrant votes were in places where there are hardly any migrants. So it's not really about migration. It's a kind of substitute or a kind of for something else. It's been fixated onto migration as issue. That will solve our problems if we stop this. It's not actually about that. And indeed, the most recent poll said that people who thought that migration was the biggest problem facing Britain has dropped from 48% in 2016 to 16% now. So it's not, you know, this isn't necessarily something that's in top people's minds all the time. But more fundamentally, if we seriously think that there are 17 million racists and proto-fascists in this country who voted leave, then we're fucked, basically. We might as well get in a boat to the Faroe Islands now and get out. It isn't true. Not all of these people are hardened racists, most of them aren't, and they're all deeply complex and confused and contradictory views in their heads. A lot of the places they voted to leave voted for Corbyn MPs and so on. So it's not like this is all just one narrative. There are contradictions here, and we have to see that's the point. What there is a polarisation in British and Scottish society between the right and the left. The problem is the right of political parties articulating what they want. The left doesn't have party, and that's the difficulty. It doesn't mean there aren't people on the left. We know that because there are social movements and things happening around about environment, around about women, and so on. But this is the problem. So, sort of bring us to a conclusion. Sorry. The difficulty. I mean, I don't have time to go into the history of the EU, and I've done that before here. But simply to make the point that the most powerful institutions in the European Union are the least democratic. The European Central Bank, the Commission, the Court of Justice, these are the ones that hold the actual power, not the pretendy Parliament that Alan Smith loves so much. And so this is not a thing that has any power whatsoever. The unelected bureaucrats, the rule makers, they are the people who have the power in the EU, and that will not change. I don't think it's reformable, because it's designed not to be reformable. That's the whole point. It's meant to be a series of rules and bureaucracies that are not susceptible to democratic action. That isn't going to change, short of revolutionary change, which would probably mean the EU would be redundant. Anyway, it's also worth noting, by the way, because people occasionally say things like, oh, you can still nationalise things like the railway system and so on. You can't. What the EU rules allow is for states to actually run particular bits of an infrastructure or transport system if they compete with other ones to get it, or if there's a pressing individual case, like there's no private contender wanting to take it over, as there wasn't in the East Coast Main Line, for example. What you cannot do is take over an industry and run it in the public interest as a non-profit, or that profit isn't the major key for what's happening. That is not allowable, right? You can own little bits of ferries or rails or whatever, but you can't nationalise the whole thing without great difficulty. Okay. The problem to me seems to be that, unlike IndieRef, where the left did actually put its stamp on the whole process, the left didn't do that over Brexit. That's a problem. It's my fault as much as everybody else's, but that's the reality. The right were allowed to dominate it, and the left-wing argument wasn't allowed to be there. We cannot allow this to carry on. And I think the point reminds me, whatever happens, there are certain things that we have to do. And that seems to me to be to unite the left across parties around about two issues. And one is migration and the free movement of people, which we are for, absolutely, not just in terms of what the EU allows, because the EU is a racist institution that prevents people getting into it as well. No, we're for the world to come here if they want, and vice versa. So we're for that, and that should be an absolute demand we need to make across the board. Whatever's in favour of that should sign up and be part of a social movement arguing for it. The second, this means about austerity. I think fundamentally it means rebuilding the trade union movement, and particularly in those bits that have never been unionised. That's starting to happen in some of those areas like Deliveroo and so on now, but that has to be an absolute priority for the left, is to rebuild trade unions. And this means working with people who are opposed to independence. It means working with people in the Labour Party who don't support independence, and it means people who support Leave and Remain also working together for these goals. There's no other way of doing this. We have to be able to put these things beside us and say there are two things we're fighting. I agree what things are. There are two things we're fighting for, and we have to unite around about them, whatever our positions are and anything else. Obviously, there'll be tactical fallout and disagreement over particular things, but if we can unite on these goals and how we organise for them, then we can get over some of the divisions I think that Brexit has brought into the left.
Okay, thanks to both the speakers. What would be really good, we'll try and